in Winter Basin the year the cold winds toppled even the sturdiest roofs. While neighbors hurriedly sealed their cabins to beat the first blast of the season, one man named Eli Granger was only just beginning to build something the valley had never seen. A curved straw wall as high as the eaves 7 feet out from Stoff, his shack, and packed with loose bales of straw. The neighbors called it a farce. They called him wasteful. They said a simple plank shack, carefully caulked at every seam, was all any man needed before winter. But Eli kept building running cross-braced guy lines, remeasuring the angle of every frame piece and cutting vent gaps at the base of the wall while everyone else just shook their heads. Then the 30 degrees Fahrenheit night arrived earlier than forecast. Winds poured down the valley in gusts of 30 to 40 miles an hour, driving snow through every plank seam, and the standard cabins quickly turned into ice boxes. Water froze solid in buckets only feet from the stove. Families across the area burned load after load of firewood, yet still woke up in sub-zero cold. But Eli's shack behind the straw wall, once mocked as foolish, held steady from one dawn to the next, staying nearly 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding cabins. What had he understood about wind, about dead air, about heat loss, that the entire community had dismissed as a laughable notion? Eli Granger arrived in Winter Basin at the end of spring with an old wooden trunk, a few homemade tools and ideas. About wind that his neighbors spent months ridiculing. Eli Granger grew up among the howling hills of northern Wyoming, where winter winds knifed through canyons like blades, and he learned early that a single wall rarely stopped what the weather was determined to take. His father, a sailor who spent years on the Great Lakes, built storage sheds with double walls and still air gaps, while Eli himself spent summers working logging camps, where crews built rough insulated bunkhouses to hold whatever warmth remained against bone-deep cold. He had seen crews stuff planer shavings, sawdust, or dry leaves between double plank walls to keep a bunkhouse livable through howling nights. But it was the downburst that year, the unseen vertical blast everyone felt only when it destroyed, that taught Eli wind was not just something that blew across the ground. It could drop straight from the sky, rip off roofs, lift a grown man's body like a dry branch. The bunkhouse where Eli and his closest friend had taken shelter collapsed in seconds, and his friend was sucked from sight in the roaring wind that still haunted Eli's dreams. When he built his shack in Winter Basin, an open valley where wind could run unimpeded for hundreds of miles, Eli decided not to repeat the mistakes of earlier years. Last winter, his shack had nearly been lifted off its foundation when the wind shifted in the night. The plank walls shook so hard he thought he heard them cracking. That night convinced him that unless he built something different, the coming winter might take his life the same way it had taken his friends. By late September, while his neighbors, men and women who had lived in Winter Basin for years, stockpiled firewood, caulked doors, and built snow fences out of habit, Eli began digging post holes, setting long lodgepole stakes, and laying out a curved line around his shack. He set the posts 2 to 3 feet apart, forming a gentle arc that embraced the small plank cabin. When Hiram Boyle, who had lived in the valley since its earliest mining days, passed by one morning and saw Eli plumbing a post with a string line, he asked, in a half-laughing, half-skeptical tone, "What exactly are you building, Eli?" Answered without looking up, "A windbreak. Like they do for storage sheds to hold warmth." Hiram spat a stream of chewing tobacco and shook his head. "That's just a fence around the house. Waste of straw and effort." But Eli kept working as if no remark could wedge itself between him and the calculations he had already made. He cut braces from scrap lumber, nailed them between the posts so the outer frame would not twist when the wind shifted. At the base of the wall, he left small gaps for water drainage, then covered them with wire mesh to keep straw from blowing out. The shape of the wall emerged, and rumors spread across the valley. Eli Granger, the man who had lived alone for 3 years, was building something strange no one had ever seen. The straw bales were packed tight, stacked onto the frame like building a wall out of soft material. From a distance it looked like nothing more than a faded yellow ring, and no one believed it could stand against ordinary wind, let alone canyon gusts. Martha Kell, the district schoolteacher, rode past and stopped to watch the half-finished structure for half a day. She tilted her head and said, "Looks like a fort, made of straw." But her voice held more curiosity than mockery. Eli pointed to the gap between the straw wall and the shack. Dead air. Moving air steals heat. Trapped air holds it. He had learned the principle not only from old logging camp bunkhouses, but from mountain ranchers who built straw windbreaks to protect livestock in winter, creating lee zones where temperatures were 10 degrees or more above the open snowfield. Eli thought if straw could keep hundreds of cattle from freezing, it could keep one man alive through the night. From late September through October, while neighbors harvested and stored food, Eli dried straw, cut it short, and tested packing density in small sections. He calculated he needed over 100 cubic feet of straw for a complete windbreak. He wanted straw dry enough not to rot, open enough to trap air, and light enough not to sail away. Around that time, Sheriff Denton stopped by, watched for a while, then blurted, "A straw wall against wind, you aiming to challenge winter itself." Some men in town concluded Eli was not right in the head, while the Whitfields passing by said, loudly, "By Christmas the mice will outnumber the snow in there." But Eli did not answer. He just kept packing straw, nailing braces, and angling the wall at about 17 degrees, the angle he believed would split the wind into two streams rather than take the full force head-on. The ridicule became routine in the valley. They called his project the crazy fence effort poured into nonsense, the foolish wall for an already bad shack. But Eli was not building for appearance. He was building to live. Early October, when breath on the shack roof froze within minutes of hitting the air, he knew the decisive moment was near. Migrating birds flew so low, their wings nearly brushed the snow, a sign an unusual cold mass was dropping. Winds shifted direction twice in one afternoon, the kind of change Eli had seen before the downburst years ago. Then the Weather Bureau sent a warning. An Arctic cold wave was heading straight for Winter Basin, capable of driving temperatures to dangerous lows. While neighbors kept mocking, kept saying Eli's straw wall would fly away in the first 10 minutes, Eli tightened every pitch-coated knot, checked every anchor stake, and walked around his faded yellow wall as if it were his own lifeline. And in the late afternoon, when a gust rolled down from the ridge carrying the metallic smell of extreme cold he had once smelled before tragedy, Eli knew the 30-degree night was close, and no one in the valley was truly ready for what it would bring. At exactly 7 p.m., before the sky had fully darkened, wind poured into Winter Basin like a freight train, barreling downhill, roaring in long surges that made the ground tremble faintly underfoot. The sudden cold cut through every layer of clothing sharp enough that even breath felt like blades. In less than 2 hours, temperature plunged from -5 to -30, a drop so abrupt the old-timers said they saw only once in decades. Not far from Eli's shack, the Whitfields' house took the first full blast. One hard gust and the front door burst open as if kicked, slamming against the wall with a boom that made their sleeping child scream awake. Water in the bucket near the stove froze in 40 minutes, a cloudy white layer spreading from rim to center, so fast the Whitfields barely registered what was happening. Both tried stuffing blankets into door cracks to block wind, but the suction was too strong, pulling whatever warmth remained outward like invisible hunger. At Boyle's cabin, the situation was worse. The stove that had been roaring red was suddenly backdrafted smoke, billowing into the room until eyes burned and no one could breathe. Boyle struggled to hold the stove door while hearing wall planks, shutter beams creaking as if ready to snap. He knew one more direction shift and the entire roof could lift off like a box lid. At Martha Kell's place, the heavy winter blankets she had used for years were pierced by wind as if no plank wall stood behind them. Wind drove in from floor, roof, and door seams, making her 2 children shiver uncontrollably despite every blanket in the house piled on them. In each home, wind was not just wind. It was a force that bent wood, extinguished fire, and drew body heat away faster than anyone could react. But inside Eli's shack, amid the chaos, everything was utterly different. When the wind hit, it struck the straw wall first. Instead of slamming straight into the shack, the flow split in two, sliding along the curve of the wind wall and spilling out either side like water around a rock prow. The space between straw wall and shack, the dead air zone Eli had planned for weeks, remained calm, no shaking, no suction, no sudden pressure. Inside the shack, the stove flame stood straight, burning steady and undisturbed like in Boyle's backdrafted cabin. Warmth spread and stayed. Even the water bucket by the door did not freeze. None of that seemed possible to anyone in the valley. A few men who had mocked Eli most fiercely decided to brave the storm to see what that stupid straw was doing in the blizzard. Hiram Boyle, wrestling stove smoke, wrapped a scarf over his face and plunged outside, thinking that if he did not see it himself, he would never believe any rumor tomorrow. And when they reached the straw wall, the first thing that stopped them dead was watching the wind visibly deflected right in front of them. Outside the straw wall, gusts were so strong a man could barely stand, but a few steps closer, right at the curve's edge, wind slowed dramatically as if held back by an invisible hand. The howling faded to a heavy sigh. Hiram reached out and felt the boundary between fierce wind and calm only inches apart. He looked at the straw wall he had called crazy countless times and for the first time in his life had nothing to say. On the other side, Eli's shack stood solid, quiet, as if the terrifying blasts were hitting somewhere else entirely. And in that moment, those who had ridiculed Eli suddenly realized the thing they had scorned for weeks might be the only thing in the valley unafraid of wind. Deep in the night, with wind holding steady at 30 to 40 miles an hour for hours, and temperature locked at -30, Eli did not sit still like others, shivering in cabins across the valley. He knew that if he wanted proof his straw wall truly worked, he had to record numbers while the wind was at its most dangerous. Eli pulled an old leather notebook from under the bed, the one he had used for years to log daily wind directions. He took a charcoal pencil and his homemade anemometer, just a thin wooden axle, lathe strips for blades, and a tin disc for wind catch. In cold, so bitter breath froze instantly. Eli cracked the shack door only wide enough to slip through, then edged along the narrow path between shack and wind wall. On the outer face of the straw wall, wind slapped so hard every step felt pushed backward. Eli set the anemometer on the outermost anchor stake, held it level, and watched the wooden blades spin. Within seconds he rode outside, wind 39 to 42 miles an hour. Sudden gusts tilted the blades sharply, prompting a note wind, unsteady signs of downward plunge from above. After measuring outside, Eli slipped into the lee. Only steps from the straw wall, wind nearly vanished. When he set the anemometer on the ground near the shack door, blades turned so slowly they seemed iced over. East-facing angle 4 to 5 miles an hour. North-facing 5 to 6. Directly at the door only about 4. The difference between zones was so stark that even Eli, who had believed in his design from the start, paused several breaths to feel the strange contrast. It was not luck. It was wind stripped of power the moment it hit the straw wall. After wind speeds, Eli pulled a small mercury thermometer from his coat pocket. Outside, reading mercury dropped near bottom. Then in the lee zone, he recorded an 18 to 22 degree difference. That was why the water bucket inside did not freeze, something anyone in the valley witnessing would have called impossible in tonight's cold. He turned and looked at the stove flame through the door crack. Flame stood straight, not pulled even slightly. The sight reminded Eli of logging camp winds. Years ago, one leak and flame bent, then died instantly. But here, where weakness should have been, greatest flame stood tall. For a final check, Eli lit a scrap of paper and held it into the wind. Outside the wind wall, the flame bent 90 degrees, nearly extinguishing in the downward blast. But stepping into the lee and trying again, the flame stood upright, swaying only gently, like breathing. At that exact moment, Hiram Boyle, who had risked the storm to see how crazy Eli really was, stood right behind and saw everything. He watched the flame, the barely turning anemometer, then the straw wall taking the full outside force. In the faint glow of the oil lamp, Hiram whispered almost to himself, "I never thought straw could do this." Eli answered softly, low and brief, "Not the straw, the air behind it." Hiram fell silent. It was no longer the silence of a mocker, but the silence of a man relearning what he had believed his whole life. When Eli closed the notebook, he knew tonight was not just his own test. The numbers recorded wind speeds, temperature differentials, airflow directions were clear proof the wind wall was not chance. It worked because it followed the laws of wind pressure, flow split and slowed before it could destroy. And in that moment, in the narrow calm only steps from the storm, the image of Eli in the eyes of those who had mocked him began to shift. They no longer saw him as an eccentric clinging to a meaningless idea, but as the only person in the valley who had read what the wind had been trying to say for days. But just as Eli wrote the final line in his notebook, the wind outside shifted again. At first only small eddies mixed into the familiar canyon howl, but then the entire flow blowing from the west suddenly veered north-northwest, carrying a deeper, lower sound like metal bending. Eli recognized the change instantly. When wind shifted that way, pressure would pile directly onto the leading curve of the wind wall, where straw took the heaviest load. Seconds later, an unexpected downburst, a vertical plunge of wind slammed the leading joint, making a sound like a tree trunk snapping. The shack shuddered for the first time that night, and Eli knew it was not a good sign. He quickly blew out the test paper flame, tucked the leather notebook inside his coat, and rushed outside the lee. The instant he crossed the straw wall edge, Eli felt as if someone shoved him sideways, the wind so strong he had to lean to stay balanced. Straw at the top began tearing from bindings, long strands whipping into the dark like shredded gold ribbons. A northern lodgepole post showed slight movement, tiny, but enough to tell him that if wind kept hitting that spot, the entire frame could twist and break. The calm zone he had created over weeks suddenly narrowed, pressing closer to the shack. Stove flame inside remained steady, but the whole structure around it was now facing a test Eli was not sure he had accounted for. He had no choice but to go out and reinforce the wall before it was too late. Eli wrapped a scarf over his face, pulled his coat tight, and opened the shack door only wide enough to slip through. In an instant, his breath froze into white frost before his eyes. Every inhale burned like swallowing ice. Side gusts forced him to crouch, low boots gripping the frozen ground to avoid being pushed backward. Each step was a struggle between his frail body and the invisible force ravaging the valley. Reaching the leading anchor, Eli yanked the rope to test it and felt rope barbs cut into his palms. Blood welled and froze instantly into thin films. But he did not pull away, only wrapped another turn and leaned lower, pressing his full body weight against the stake. As he tightened the knot, a powerful down plunge struck from above, hitting him like a giant's punch. Eli was knocked down, knees slamming frozen ground. In that moment his body reeled. 1 second slower and wind could have hurled him out of the lee, flinging him into lethal darkness. But by reflex, Eli jammed a knee into the ground, hands still gripping the frozen rope, fingernails digging into stiffened fibers. Straw from the top whipped into his face like golden rain, swirling then vanishing into night. Eli struggled upright, but no steadiness remained. Everything opposed him: wind, cold, old memories. For one brief second, the image of his friend swept away years ago flashed so clearly Eli thought he heard the helpless cry again in the white night. That moment pulled Eli back to the only reason he refused to give up. He knew how fast wind could take a life before a person even understood what happened. And now, in the shack right behind him, people were sheltering people who had fled homes, shaking apart. He could not let the wind wall collapse. If it fell, wind would strike the shack directly, and in seconds warmth inside would vanish like breath into air. Eli understood that if he failed now, those trusting the straw wall they had once mocked might die under the same wind that took his best friend. That realization, not fear but responsibility, made Eli tighten the rope once more, despite blood on his hands freezing into red streaks. Wind kept howling, but Eli stood there like the final stake in a night of madness, testing every decision he had ever made. While Eli still wrestled anchor ropes and wild gusts, the surrounding cabins finally lost the fight to the night's overwhelming pressure. At the Whitfields, the front door, already braced with 2 thick timbers, burst open a second time with a crack like splitting wood. Reverse suction pulled stove ash swirling upward, nearly snuffing the weak flame. Their child wrapped in 3 blankets, lips turning purple from entrushing cold. The Whitfields realized staying another minute risked no one surviving the night. At Boyle's cabin, the roof shook in waves, creaking like twisting bone in wind. Each plunge made Boyle feel the roof lift, then drop, a dangerous cycle anyone who had lived through storms knew could end with the whole roof torn away without trace. Stove smoke poured back into the cabin, making air stifling until Boyle's elderly mother coughed hoarsely, hands trembling from cold and fear. Farther off, Martha Kell held her 2 small children in the shaking dark. She clearly heard a long crack run along a wall plank, sound of wood bending past its limit. Blankets used to block wind were useless now. Wind pierced as if her cabin were an empty box with no protection. None of them had courage left to wait and see if their cabins would last until morning. And one by one, in driving snow and howling wind, they all remembered the only thing in the valley still standing, the straw wall they had mocked for weeks. The Whitfields went first. He carried the blue-lipped child pressed to his chest under his thickest coat and plunged outside. Wind nearly knocked both down, but he braced and took step after step toward the straw curve. Right behind came Boyle, supporting his elderly mother, each step pushed backward, her breath breaking into white fragments in the gale. Martha Kell burst from her cabin, clutching both children, face pale in the storm's dim light. They said nothing, no cries for help, no strength for calling. Only the roar of wind and boots crunching frozen snow. But as they neared Eli's wind wall, something strange happened. The moment they crossed the curve's edge, wind dropped sharply enough that all 3 families halted, as if stepping from storm into another world entirely. Outside the straw wall, wind still screamed, but here it was only heavy breathing, no longer icy slaps to the face. Boyle looked up at the straw wall, eyes wide in disbelief. Whitfields hugged his child tighter, glancing around to confirm the quiet was not illusion. Martha stood still, several seconds, her children beside her, stopping their shivering because wind no longer cut through clothing. When Eli saw them from the shack door, he flung it, wider voice carrying over the outside gale. "Get inside, hurry!" They rushed into the shack, nearly collapsing from relief. And right there, the moment every past mockery seemed to dissolve, they looked around and noticed first the shack interior was markedly warmer than their homes minutes earlier. Stove flame burned steady and upright, not pulled sideways at all. The water bucket by the door remained liquid, not frozen like the Whitfields. The children stopped shivering their breath, no longer thick white clouds. Everyone looked at one another, astonishment clear in every pair of eyes. No one spoke it aloud, but all understood that tonight, in the fiercest storm they had ever faced, the place they had ridiculed, called crazy, useless, had become the only spot in the valley, giving them feeling they might live to see. Morning. Inside the shack, as warmth returned and children's shivers eased, raw panic finally showed on every adult face. They knew they had only temporary escape from wind, but no one knew how long the wind wall would hold. Boyle glanced out the door toward the straining straw curve and asked in a trembling voice, "Will it hold?" Eli did not answer immediately. He knew if wind shifted again, the wall would need reinforcement. He also knew if their cabins out there collapsed morning might leave only a few survivors in the valley. So instead of panicking with them, Eli drew a deep breath and kept his voice strangely calm. "We'll have to build secondary walls. Right now." Before they could process it, Eli was already assigning groups. No discussion, no debate. "Whitfields, you come with me to reinforce the north side. Boyle, prepare materials by the door. Martha, you keep the children and Boyle's mother warm. No one goes out unless I say." No one objected. Eli's voice was no longer that of the man mocked for weeks, but of the only person who truly understood what was happening outside. He opened a wooden crate by the table and pulled out items almost no one thought valuable now. Old burlap sacks, a few tarps he had salvaged from past roof repairs, short lumber pieces, hemp rope, and leftover loose straw from the original build. Before questions came, Eli explained, "We don't need pretty. We just need to cut wind speed 40 to 60%. That's enough for cabins to last until morning." Then he instructed each group stuff sacks with loose straw, tie tight, and line them up. Stretch tarps at angles so wind slides upward instead of hitting flat. Whitfields, who had never respected Eli a day in his life, now listened to every word. Boyle, who had earlier called the straw wall pure madness, now bowed his head, tying each rope exactly as directed, hands shaking but never arguing. When groups had materials ready, Eli lit a thin scrap of paper and held it out the door for all to see. North wind snatched the flame, bending and nearly killing it instantly. Then he stepped into the lee, only steps away, and held the flame up again. This time it stood straight, swaying gently as if no storm were tearing the valley apart outside. The effect silenced everyone. For Winter Basin people, wind was the most terrifying because invisible. But now before their eyes, Eli had done what none of them ever imagined. He made wind visible, showed its boundary, proved it could be deflected. Doubt in Whitfield's eyes vanished. Martha looked at Eli with a face holding no mockery, only trust she could not yet name. Boyle nodded hard, as if finally understanding what he had ignored for years. Wind cannot be beaten by force, but can be slowed by understanding. From that second, Eli's words were no longer those of a busybody, but instructions from the person holding everyone's lives. No arguing, no trying to sound wiser. They followed every step, every direction Eli gave, even if only how to angle a sack or tie a knot into the wind. The people who had shaken heads and laughed at him now worked beside him in the worst storm they had ever known, completely convinced that if anything would get them to morning, it was the preparations Eli had made alone for weeks. While everyone hurriedly tied ropes, built secondary walls, and rechecked anchors per Eli's orders, a staggering figure appeared in the white, swirling wind outside the straw curve. At first just a shape lurching against the storm, but as it neared, the shack lamp glow revealed Sheriff Denton's face, the man who had mocked Eli more than anyone in the valley. His coat was torn by wind, fur, hat long gone, hands clutching his collar, shaking violently. He did not try to act tough or offer his usual quip. He only managed 2 words, voice hoarse and nearly swallowed by wind. "Let me in." Eli said nothing, just nodded and pulled him into the lee. Within the straw curve, Denton stopped as if crossing an invisible door. Wind dropped sharply, no longer slashing his face. Air still cold, but no longer the breath-stealing cold outside. Martha looked at the sheriff, usually stern, somewhat disliked, now standing shivering in the calm, while Boyle avoided his eyes, not from dislike, but because something in their old beliefs had just collapsed. When Denton stepped inside the shack, silence enveloped everyone. Stove light cast golden glow on crowded faces, children, elderly, mother, fathers, holding sons, neighbors who daily argued over wind and land. But now no one spoke. Outside, wind still screamed around the straw wall, but inside only soft breathing and crackling firewood. They looked at Eli, not sneaking glances or curious stares like before, but openly with unspoken acknowledgement. One by one, though no one voiced sorry, gratitude mixed with shame showed on every face. Hiram Boyle glanced at Eli, then lowered his head as if returning every mocking smile he had given over weeks. Martha rested a hand on her children's shoulders, eyes toward Eli, holding trust she once reserved only for family. Whitfields gave a small nod, a gesture saying more than any apology. Sheriff Denton, who had declared to the whole town the straw wall was clearest sign of a madman, sat near the stove, hands outstretched for warmth, eyes avoiding Eli but unable to hide deep embarrassment in every breath. No one in the shack spoke apology, but none was needed. That night's silence was the silence of people finally realizing there were things they did not understand, people they had misjudged, and moments when an entire community's survival rested in the hands of the man they had ridiculed. And in the calm he himself had created, Eli became the natural anchor, not because he wanted it, but because the storm night had chosen him. When first light filtered over the ridge, no one inside the shack noticed morning had come until wind sounds dropped to occasional whistles. Eli opened the door and stepped out, the group following one by one, each carrying vague dread about what they would see. The sight before them was unlike anything witnessed. Boyle's ranch yard torn into strips, planks scattered as if tossed. Whitfield's cabin roof reduced to skeleton tin, long vanished into the night wind. Martha Kell's fence, considered the strongest in Winter Basin, now flattened like broken matchsticks. The whole valley looked freshly ravaged by a force no human effort could resist. Yet right in the middle of the devastation, Eli's straw curve stood intact, like a paradoxical halo. True, a few bales had been ripped free, stray strands still drifting in morning air, but the main structure held firm, no twist, no settling, no lean. And the small shack inside, where they had spent a night they thought unsurvivable, was almost unbelievably untouched. Only a thin ice glaze on the roof, and a few straw pieces by the door, absolutely no sign of wind damage. The contrast was so stark, everyone stood frozen outside, chaos, ruin, breakage. At the center, a rough straw wall standing like a fortress. No one spoke for the first seconds. Each only stared, gazing hard at what last night they had still called crazy. Whitfield's broke the silence. First voice hoarse from emotion or lingering cold. Eli, can you show us how to build one of these for our places? Boyle no longer wore his usual gruffness. He stepped closer to Eli's arm, still supporting his elderly mother, eyes full of regret forged in the storm night. If I'd done it sooner, my cabin wouldn't have lost its roof. Martha Kell nodded repeatedly, face pale but voice strangely firm. We need to learn, all of us. Sheriff Denton stood last, nose-red torn coat flapping in morning's light wind. He slowly looked from windwall to shack, then back to Eli, with the eyes of a man finally seeing what he should have seen long ago. We're ready to listen to you. In that moment, every mocking laugh, every jeering word, every dismissive glance from weeks before vanished. Only a community remained amid rubble, facing the man they had once seen as a fool, and now the only one who could help them stand against the long winter still ahead. That very morning, while wind had not fully died, and people were still picking up pieces from shattered cabins, Eli knelt on ground, hard as rock, using a stick to draw in thin snow. The first lines of the technique he simply called proper wind, wall. He pointed to each part, voice even and clear, as if teaching a classroom. Post spacing must be exactly 36 inches, no more, no less. Straw wall angle must be 17 degrees, so wind hitting rises and splits sideways instead of pressing flat. Straw packing density about 7 pounds per cubic foot. Enough for structure, but not so tight it loses material flexibility. Wind buffer behind wall must be 7 feet for stable calm. And most important, the double anchor technique, 2 crossed guy lines to resist strong plunges from odd directions. Neighbors, though dazed by loss, listened with absolute focus, memorizing every detail as if their lives depended on it. Soon, every cabin in the valley began building its own version. Boyle's a small one, tight to the wall to save straw. Whitfield's a medium curve with softer arc because wind at their ranch often shifted. Martha Kell a double-layer main and secondary, exactly as Eli advised. Not far away, a large cattle ranch tested a nearly 40-foot wind wall to shield stock from wind chill, and in one trial night, they saw clear reduction in cold stress on cattle hides. Word spread faster than wind. The county clerk, hearing Sheriff Denton's report, rode personally to Eli's shack and asked him to write full technical diagrams for publication in that year's winter bulletin, something never done for any settler project in Winter Basin. A small valley school even built a straw windbreak around the temporary classroom to stop gusts that kept making children sick. Most interesting was the community change. Those who had mocked, calling Eli the crazy straw wall man, now became the ones spreading the technique by word of mouth. At market gatherings, trading meets, they all said the same thing: the Winter Basin wind wall, it saved the whole valley. The story spread in folk fashion, climbing hills into Idaho, then Montana, where cold wind was always the old enemy of settlers. And at the center of the story was always the image of one quiet man standing in wind, tying bale after bale, with belief no one then understood until the 30 degrees Fahrenheit night turned disbelief into undeniable truth. The following winter arrived with valley-wide mixture of tension and vigilance, because everyone knew only reality would prove whether what they learned from Eli could stand against sky wind. Early season, 25-30 miles per hour blows swept Winter Basin. But this time 3 hillside ranches where cattle sheds once had doors ripped open stood firm. Livestock no longer panicked and huddled, no longer roof planks, rattling loud enough to keep people awake. At Martha Kell's house, firewood used through January dropped 30%, a figure that left even Martha stunned, because for years she had believed in this region to live you burn more than you think. Whitfield's had Private Joy, the child who last year turned blue-lipped and nearly did not survive, now toddled around the house all day, no longer curled by the stove. Those changes made people begin to understand the straw tied to lodgepole stakes was not just a cold avoidance trick, it was something that raised the entire area to a new living standard. That same winter, new data kept being recorded. Temperature in the Lee, behind wind walls, averaged 14 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, even in deep sub-zero. Wind speed, measured by homemade devices, dropped up to 70% at 6-8 feet behind walls, and cabins with curved windbreaks saw indoor bucket freezing nearly eliminated. The numbers were rough but carried weight no scientific report could match, because they were measured by hands of people who nearly lost their lives in the 30 degrees Fahrenheit night the year before. Gradually, life changed in ways even Eli had not expected. Every valley cabin was retrofitted to the new standard they jokingly called wind wall method. Livestock sheds were built to create natural lee zones. Even paths between ranches were laid out to reduce side gusts into homes. Valley children began calling Eli a name that made him both laugh and feel strange: Windman. They ran after him whenever he passed, asking about wind straw, invisible swirls they had never noticed before. And in adults' eyes, though never spoken aloud, there was always acknowledgement that because of him, because of the idea, once ridiculed, their winters had become less brutal, less threatening, and gave more than they took. By the end of the second winter, word of the Winter Basin straw wall had spread far enough that a small survey team from the northern mountain region visited the valley, bringing notebooks, tape measures, and cameras to examine firsthand what, they heard, had changed an entire community's wind resistance. They walked every property, measured distances, recorded angles, tested double anchor strength, then stood long in front of Eli's original straw curve around his shack before asking to copy everything into a volume titled Mountain Wind. Resistance notes later used as reference for many other high country areas. When asked about what many now called a life-saving invention, Eli only smiled, hand resting on a wind-faded bale. "Nothing genius," he said slowly. "Just respect for the wind." That answer made the survey team regard him in prolonged silence, a silence showing they understood he was not being modest but speaking truth. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted down the mountain, edge wind blew familiarly through the valley. It met the wind wall, split into 2 gentler streams, rose and curved away like water meeting rock shore. Behind the calm, children chased each other, through snow, and laughed loudly, completely unaware that only a year earlier the ground they played on had been open to gusts strong enough to rip roofs away. Eli's shack stood quiet, small but serene, proof that sometimes the most ridiculed thing is exactly what saves an entire community. And in Winter Basin, whenever wind rose, people no longer feared as before, because they had learned wind can be directed and can be respected. And most important, change sometimes starts with one person willing to do what the whole world calls foolish. Thank you for following the story to the end. I hope it has given you a fresh perspective on the power of unconventional ideas. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to join us for more stories ahead. See you in the next video.